Let's sew the midi skirt. This skirt was designed with pretty much one thing in mind, that being summertime. This sewing pattern is now available in my Etsy shop in multiple different files for you to print whatever works best for you. So with that being said, let's get into sewing. So once you've printed your PDF pattern and taped everything together, it's time to cut your fabric. For this sewing pattern, everything is cut on the fold. So you'll cut one top skirt, two bottom skirts, your waistband, and a lining is optional. The lining piece for sizes 20 through 30 is not cut on the fold, and that was done intentionally to hopefully save you some money on fabric. First, we're going to start by working on the bottom tier of the midi skirt, and essentially what we're doing is we're putting together one very long rectangle. So with right sides together, we're going to take one short edge and attach it to the other short edge. And this creates a super long rectangle that we can use to gather down, and that gives us that really fancy, flouncy bottom edge of the skirt. If you're working with a print like I am, make sure that when you put these two pieces right sides together that you're properly matching your pattern print. And for any seam that isn't a basting stitch, be sure that you're back stitching those seams for reinforcement. And with your first seam complete, it's time to finish the edge. If you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. So now you should have a really long rectangle. It actually didn't even fit on my sewing table, so I have it scrunched up here. But now it's time to give this seam a really good pressing before we start sewing our gathering stitches. When we get this seam nice and flat, when we do create our gathers, it helps hide this seam. Using a long stitch length, I'm using a 4 here, we're going to sew our first line of gathering stitches. So you'll see I'm going to insert my needle, but I am not going to back stitch. We need the freedom to move the fabric along this thread. Now, you'll see a lot of sewists, and I do this myself sometimes when I'm being lazy, only sew one line of gathering. Let me tell you, just sew 2 of them. It makes your life so much easier. And I'm just sewing this first line. It should be sewn about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. Now I'm working on my second line of stitching, keeping it parallel to my first line of stitching, and I'm about 1/8 of an inch away from that first line. Be very careful that you do not cross your stitch lines here. If you do accidentally sew over that first line, you will not be able to gather the fabric, and you'll have to remove all those stitches and start over. So take your time. So now it's time to start working on gathering that fabric down using those 2 lines of stitches that you just created. You can see here I've laid out my top skirt, and I'm going to use that to reference what width I need to gather this fabric down to. So all I'm doing to gather the fabric is I'm holding the ends of the 2 stitches that I just sewed, the 2 top pieces, and I just hold them and then I shimmy the fabric down those 2 pieces of thread. I think it's easiest to work in halves when you are working with such long gathers, so it's a little difficult to see, but I lined up my seam on my bottom skirt piece with the middle point of my top skirt, and I'm just kind of working in sections. So the more amount of time that you spend making your gathers even, the better your skirt is going to look. It's also really important that you pull those gathers over that seam because it helps hide the seam when you're wearing the skirt. This part can also be a little time consuming, but again, the longer you take, the more meticulous you are, the better your skirt will look. So with right sides together here, I am pinning my bottom skirt piece to the top skirt piece. And now, using our standard 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're going to carefully sew these two pieces together. Don't forget to switch your stitch length back to a standard stitch length as well. And before you move on to the next step, this is a good time to double check your work, make sure you sewed everything evenly and didn't miss any spots. Here I'm just using my serger to finish this seam. If you are working with a serger, they cut and sew at the same time, so just be very careful that you're not cutting into any of the fabric. Now it's time for some cleanup work. You're going to want to take your seam ripper and very gently remove any visible basting stitches. Don't forget to take a moment to pause and admire your work thus far. With right sides together, we're going to sew up that side seam. Finish the edge and then you can set this aside so we can get started on the lining. This sewing pattern has optional instructions for lining and we are going to be using that today. So this pattern piece is the same pattern piece that we used for the top skirt. I'm using my serger to finish the bottom edge and to sew up the side seam of this skirt. You can hem the bottom edge if you want, but since it's not visible, I'm just going to be using my serged edge as my hem for inside the skirt. You'll also notice that I serged the top edge of this piece, but that isn't a necessary step at this time. That seam will be finished when we attach the waistband. And here I am just sewing up that side seam for the lining. The lining piece for sizes 20 through 30 is slightly different. It's not cut on the fold, so you will have two side seams to sew up. And with wrong sides facing, we're going to drop the lining into the skirt. This helps hide the seams from the inside of the skirt when you're wearing it. And we're just going to baste the lining to the top of the skirt. And don't worry about finishing either of these edges right now. They will be finished neatly after we install the waistband. Using a 1/8 seam allowance, I'm going to baste these two pieces together. From the middle of my needle to the right edge of my foot on my machine, that is about 1/8 of an inch. So I just use that as my guide when sewing. You can measure yours on your machine as well. Now we're going to sew our first seam for the waistband. So with right sides together using our standard seam allowance, 3/8 of an inch, we're just going to sew that short end together. And with that seam complete, we're going to fold the waistband wrong sides together lengthwise. And before you move on to the next step, be sure you give this a good pressing. And now it's time to pin the waistband to the top of the skirt. So here I'm just making sure that my seams match. And remember to leave at least a 3-inch opening. We're not going to be sewing this shut all the way around because we need to be able to insert elastic into the waistband. And now it's time to sew the waistband to the skirt using our standard seam allowance. Using the opening that we left on the waistband, we're going to insert the elastic. I just use a safety pin to help me shimmy the elastic through the waistband. Eventually your elastic will make it to the other side, and this is a good time to pause and make sure that your elastic isn't twisted inside of that band, because our next step is to sew the elastic band together. Using a zigzag stitch, I run quite a few lines of stitching up and down this portion of the elastic to make sure that it's super secure. And now that your elastic waistband is complete, it's time to evenly distribute the fabric along the elastic waistband, and we can also sew shut the opening that we used for the waistband. This part can be a little bit tricky. I just do my best to move the elastic out of the way, because if you catch the elastic in this seam on the waistband, then you won't be able to freely move the elastic band inside the skirt. So here we're just working on closing the seam. And now you can finish this seam however you prefer. I'm just using my serger, being very careful not to catch the elastic waistband. And now we're on the final step, the hem. I always hem my garments last just to make sure that everything's all nice and even. And I'm just going to serge this raw edge and then turn it to the inside and hem, but really you can hem this garment however you prefer. And that's it. Thanks so much for watching. As always, leave me a comment, send me an email if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one.